My name's Peter Davis, and I'm a member of the faculty at St Mary's and teacher on this particular programme that you're doing. And my talk today is going to be looking at diversity and unity, making the most of difference in the cooperative. It's going to be a rather personal conversation, but one that relates directly to the materials that you're doing in the course. I want to start really by making a point about origin. Origins, where does discrimination come from? Where does the conflicts that we often face, the closures, the sense of alienation, of other, the fear of the other, where does this come from in our society and in our culture? And why is it so general? I think if we understand the roots of where discrimination comes from in its origins, we can a better way to deal with it, both as an organisation and also within ourselves, because we all have prejudices and we all have attitudes towards that other, whatever that other might be, from the point of view of our own perspectives and our own culture. And one of the origins that we should remember is that of scarcity. From the very beginning of humankind, we've been hunters and gatherers. We've had to have territories, there's been areas that we've needed in order to feed ourselves. And the sense of the other, another tribe, another region, another race, it all stems from this conflict about land, conflict about resources. And of course the great thing today about the cooperative movement is that it's trying to overcome that conflict of otherness. It's trying to overcome the sense of haves and have-nots. This is mine, you can't have any of it. That kind of mentality, by saying, no, actually, we all have a share, we all have a stake, and what the cooperative tries to do is to give accessibility, to give access to the means of production, give access to the means of raw materials, in order that we can all share, and in that sharing, we can be secure for our futures. So, in a sense, overcoming diversity as a barrier to organisations is fundamental to the whole cooperative ethos. But I want to talk about diversity in a more positive way. I want to suggest that diversity can in fact be one of the great strengths of the cooperative movement. But before I do, let's look at some of the origins of discrimination: class, race, region, gender, religion, and of course orientation, sexual orientation. All these have been identified as the basis for discriminating against people in employment, in access to opportunities, in society in general, housing as well. And what I would want to say is that whilst, if you look at the literature, there's a lot of concentration on race and gender, and increasingly more recently in areas of orientation, but class and region and religion are less prominent, and yet they're very often underlying a lot of tensions and conflicts within organisations. Speaking as an Englishman, class is a very serious issue. I know many of you looking at this will say, well, hang on a minute, what's this white man doing talking about discrimination? Shouldn't there be a black guy or a woman here who after all have had a lot more experience of discrimination than I have? But then you see, you'd be wrong, because when I was a young person, when I went into an examination room, I had to write my father's occupation at the top of the exam paper. I was being discriminated against on the basis of class, because the local education authority was quite convinced that a working class person wouldn't benefit from a grammar school education in England. This is in the 1950s. My late wife, actually, her class was segregated physically. The village children, which is a euphemism for the sons and daughters of agricultural labourers, in the 1950s in a Midlands village, were physically segregated in the class. So there's class discrimination is actually very prevalent in England, and I think underlies an awful lot of the discrimination one finds all around the world. Race too. As a matter of fact, in East London, not so long ago, I was actually spat at and abused by a woman who thought I was Jewish. She called me a Jewish bastard. I'm very proud of the fact that I didn't deny it, because I'd much rather be a Jewish bastard than a white bigot like she was. But there again, when you look at race, it's not just about black and white. There are lots of different groups and subgroups of races who find themselves pilloried. Irish people in England, Poles in Germany, Jews in many, many parts of Europe, across Europe, for example. And religion, of course, we have in my country still, in some regions, hostilities and closures between Catholics and Protestants. We all understand the problems homosexuals can face in being discriminated against. There are a number of quite infamous, I would call them, dismissal cases which were upheld by the courts until quite recently, where people's homosexuality was seen as a fair grounds for dismissal. All of these areas of diversity, all of these areas of discrimination are actually preventing and insulting and undermining the fundamental principle which is at the bottom of all cooperative social theory, and that is the dignity of the individual person. And when we're looking at diversity, managing diversity in our organisations, we need to be thinking about that dignity of the individual as primarily. We also want to remember too that there are different kinds of aptitudes, skills, knowledge, and different kinds of personality that are also very diverse, and that some of which are culturally related, some of which aren't. But in any organisation that's really wanting to grow, wanting to be relevant, has to ensure that it's got a good mix of the right kind of people who've got the aptitudes, the skills, the knowledge, and the personalities that we want. We don't want a set of clones around a table. What we need is difference in order to spark debate, in order to spark discussion. So diversity is important. At the same time, we do need unity. Cooperatives will not survive without member unity. Unity is a fundamental objective of a cooperative society. It's critical. And that unity can only come about on the basis of transparency, honesty, integrity, and respect for the dignity of people. These are common priorities for the cooperative movement, but we also say they ought to be common priorities for society as a whole. We have not, in the cooperative movement, in my judgment, a monopoly of integrity or honesty. We're entitled to expect integrity and honesty from everybody. Where the unity comes is in our values. The support of justice, the support, whether it's distributive justice or natural justice, in the demands for peace, in the demands for democracy, in the desire for fraternity, in our belief in open access, and in our celebration of voluntarism. In these values lies the basis of cooperative unity. But those values can be expressed in a very diverse range of individuals and with a very diverse range of cultures. And it's very important that we don't make the mistake of confusing conformity with unity in a cooperative, because they're very different. It's very often the case that people believing passionately about something can have very strong disagreements. That's not, we want that, we want the passion, and if that means strong disagreements, well then we work through those in a proper way with the discussion and research and analysis. We don't want to lose that passion, we want that sense of commitment, we don't want a blind conformity. The other thing I want to say in general about managing diversity and unity is that it's something that goes right through the entire HR cycle. A health warning here on the HR cycle. Whenever I talk about the HR cycle, I always want to give you a health warning, because it's important that we segment and identify different stages, different aspects of HRM as a process within the organisation. But at the same time, and in doing so, let me say immediately that in practice all of these are mutually reinforcing. They are also taking place in parallel, not in step by step. The first one is needs assessment. When we're looking at assessing our HR needs, our human capital needs, our human resource needs, as a business, we need to think about diversity. We need to think about, are we representing the communities that we're operating in our staffing? Have we got the right mix of skills and experience to drive the business forward? Are we open to newness, to a different aspect to our cultural and organisational development? And when we recruit people, we need to be thinking about, are we getting the message into the right areas? When we look at recruitment, we've got to be thinking about what mediums we're using, what messages we're presenting. Are we going to be attractive to draw to the very minorities that we are at the moment excluding from our organisation? How do we reach out to attract women, to attract ethnic minorities, to attract gay people to come and work in our environment? How do we find them? And then when we come to the selection process, how do we deal with the procedures? Are we making sure that our selection criteria doesn't discriminate indirectly? Are we confident that our own panel of selectors do not have stereotypical images and attitudes that will blind them possibly and influence them negatively towards certain groups of people or individuals? If we've got over all that and we've managed to integrate our diversity program effectively into our needs assessment, our recruitment and our selection, we've then got to think about how we bring people into the organisation, the process of induction. Is it sensitive to their needs as well as sensitive to ours? And then we come to the phase of appraisal. What are we doing there? Are we appraising people in a proper way, in a way that enables them to feel comfortable with their differences? Are we celebrating those differences in the appraisal? Are we giving them an opportunity to express themselves fully? And are we enabling them to make the real full contribution that they're capable of? And are we encouraging them? Because appraisal isn't about criticism, it's about encouragement, fundamentally. Encouraging people to take the step up the ladder, to go into jobs that they may not historically have considered as being jobs for them. How do we encourage people to accept the training and development to move up and become socially mobile within the organisation? Obviously, compensations have been a really hot issue, equal pay for women being, I guess, the primary example of where we look at diversity and discrimination in employment practices and we say, okay, we must have equal pay for equal work. We must ensure that we're putting the right values when we decide what we mean by equal work, that we're putting the right values on all people's inputs, skills, knowledge and aptitudes, and giving them a proper weighting and a fair weighting to make sure that our compensation program is genuinely discrimination free. Motivation is also very important. In a sense, diversity, a provision of pluralism, a celebration of pluralism in a cooperative is in itself a motivational factor. It's something that gives people encouragement and a sense of purpose and a sense of identity and the security to go forward and to give their best. When we do have problems, and all organisations do, with individual behaviours, particularly in areas of sexual harassment, let us remember that not everybody's behaviour is motivated by malice. What one person might think of as just a friendly joke might be deeply insulting to another person. What may not be meant as an innuendo, a sexual innuendo by some person, may be taken by another to be such. There's sometimes when people misunderstand each other. Dealing with harassment is sometimes a matter of dealing with the human being not bringing the disciplinary procedure straight in. It's a question of making people aware of their behaviours and really aware of how their behaviour is impacting on others. We only really want to get into a disciplinary situation where that person's had an opportunity to change their behaviour and to recognise the sensitivities of others. And when it comes to termination, whether it's on the grounds of misconduct, whether it's on the grounds of redundancy, or whether it's on the grounds of retirement, or people moving on to other jobs, we need always to be looking very carefully at ensuring a proper balance, that we're doing things fairly, that we're not discriminating against certain groups of people, whether because they're part-time versus full-time, etc., that we're making sure that our processes of termination are fair and just and are not indirectly discriminating against a particular group within the organisation. There's lots to be said about discrimination. There's lots of law in many parts of the world, and our texts and our materials will help you navigate your way through that. But what I want to say to you, I think this is the primary message of this little talk, is that the cooperative movement is never going to be just concerned with making sure that we're okay with the law, because we're beyond that. We're looking at a best practice, we're looking at a transformation of society, we're trying to make the world a better place. And one of the ways in which a global world is reflected is in our own employment practices. Are we thinking with sufficient pluralism in our organisational culture to really draw on the rich resources that diversity provides, and at the same time ensuring the unity within our organisation, that shared values and shared purposes around identifiable objectives and priorities like justice and like democracy and like peace, that sort of priorities, shared goals that can give us the unity with the diversity. So thank you very much for listening. Let me say that, let me just quickly recap on what I've said. In this, just to sum up in this talk, I've tried to make 7 points. The first one being that the origins of discrimination arise from scarcity and a sense of threat. The other threatens us, threatens our territory, threatens our home, threatens our ability to make a living. That sort of sense of threat. We have to understand that, and we have to be sympathetic to it, because it's a reality. People are competing in the labour market. People are competing for housing. And we do live in a society where for many resources are very scarce. And it's only understanding that enables us to have, shall I say, a more balanced approach. Rather than simply condemning a discriminatory behaviour, we need to first understand it in order to eliminate it. That's my first point. My second point is that diversity and discrimination go along many different lines. I've used my own experience, and I've talked about the fact of class discrimination and race discrimination as they affected me, a white male. But I didn't mention one other aspect of discrimination which is beginning increasingly to affect me, and that is age. Because in some parts of the world, age discrimination is still perfectly okay, and people are not able to access organisations simply because they're perceived to be too old. And that again is another area. But really most people in my country would think about racial discrimination as the primary one. Certainly in some areas regional accents can be very determining in terms of accessibility to institutions and to clubs and societies. Gender remains a hot issue. There's still the glass ceiling in many organisations that women find it very hard to get through. Religion has been and remains a tricky subject, and one where sensitivities can be can get easily inflamed if not managed. And sexual orientation too is one in which people have very deep-seated prejudices about, which can cause a lot of pain and hurt to individuals. So this whole question of second point there being that this whole question of discrimination covers a very wide range of areas and issues, and it's a very complex area, and it's not simply a race and gender issue, and there's lots of dimensions to it. My third point is that people are diverse. People have different aptitudes and skills and knowledge and different personalities, and actually we need all of that. We need that diversity. Organisations do not need to be packed with people with the one set of attitudes, the one set of skills, the one areas of knowledge, one type of personality. I did consultancy once with the De Beers organisation, no, sorry, not De Beers, the IBM, and my consultancy was accepted, but the language of my report was not, and I had to rewrite it in what they considered was IBM speak. And well, you know, that kind of conformity, language, if you have a conformity of language, you're having a conformity of ideas, you're controlling how people think, you're not going to get creativity, you're not going to get innovation in that kind of context. Fourthly, and in a sense paradoxically, a co-op needs unity. Unity is essential. How do we square unity and diversity? Well, first of all, we do it by ensuring that we have transparency, that we act with honesty and integrity and in respect for the individual, whatever the diversities concerned are. But we do emphasise in the co-op, we must emphasise the common priorities and our common values. And in my fifth point, I want to just remind us that the values that matter most are not really related to simply issues of democracy and accessibility, but real justice in its distributive and natural forms. Peace and fraternity are important values. We can't have these if we are discriminating against people. We won't ever achieve proper justice in that environment. We won't have open access. We won't be able to encourage people to volunteer if they're feeling isolated and alienated and discriminated against. My sixth point, and I think this is a very important one, is not to mistake conformity for unity in a cooperative. Unity can sometimes be expressed with very, very powerful dissent. And finally, diversity and unity must be something that we don't just talk about and pigeonhole in a particular box called our organisational objectives and goals. It goes right through everything we do in the employment activity, right the way through that HR cycle. We need to be constantly thinking about what are the implications for our diversity policy, what are are we being careful not to discriminate, are we giving everybody equal opportunities in the organisation. And I think if we are able to say that honestly to ourselves, then we will be achieving the kind of goals that a cooperative employment is trying to achieve, which is to be genuinely open to all people and to give all people the opportunity to have a full and happy work life. Thank you.